betrayed me." Her voice did not shake. It cut. The bathroom door was still slightly open. Steam drifted into the hallway. His phone lay on the kitchen counter between them, screen lit, message preview frozen in quiet accusation. "Last night meant more than you know." Ryland Cross looked at the words, then at his wife. Serafina did not scream. She did not throw the phone. She did not demand a scene dramatic enough to satisfy ego. She held his gaze. "What did it mean?" she asked. His hesitation was small, barely visible, but she saw it. 5 years of knowing him had trained her to notice pauses more than speeches. "It's not what you think." That was the moment something inside her shifted. Not because of the message, because of the pause. She stepped back, slowly removed her wedding ring. No trembling hands, no rush, just deliberate clarity. The gold touched the marble countertop with a soft, final sound. "I will not compete for my own marriage," she said. He stepped forward. "We can fix this. Fixing it would require you to understand what you broke." Silence filled the space between them. Not loud, not chaotic. Heavy. He expected anger, tears, a dramatic ultimatum. He did not expect control. She picked up her suitcase before sunrise, and she left. He thought she needed space. He had no idea she was about to change the entire direction of both their lives. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you never felt the need to check twice? Not because you were naive, but because consistency had trained you to relax. Trust does not collapse in a single night. It weakens in small omissions. Late meetings explained in summaries. Conversations shortened into bullet points. Names mentioned too casually. Serafina did not search his phone. She did not monitor his movements. She believed in partnership, not surveillance. That is what made the moment sharper. It was not only the message, it was the realization that she had stopped being included. What hurts more, the mistake itself, or the hesitation before the confession? That pause in the kitchen said more than any apology that followed. Many marriages do not end when vows are broken. They end when presence becomes optional. Serafina stood in that kitchen, not as a victim of a headline scandal, but as a woman facing a quieter question. When did I become secondary in my own life? This story begins there, not with rage, with awareness. Betrayal rarely begins with passion. It begins with absence. Absence of conversation, absence of inclusion, absence of daily effort. Ryland did not wake up intending to destroy his marriage. He convinced himself he was managing pressure, expansion season, investor calls, travel schedules, strategic dinners. He told himself he was providing, but provision without presence creates distance. Corinne did not steal him. Opportunity did not force him. Ego did not overpower him overnight. He made small allowances, a longer dinner, a private conversation that should have stayed professional, a compliment he should have redirected. By the time the message appeared on the screen, the line had already been crossed internally. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Most betrayals are not explosive events. They are the result of unattended cracks. When loyalty becomes assumed, it weakens. When attention shifts quietly, it signals something deeper. Serafina did not react to passion. She reacted to erosion, and that distinction changes everything. Tonight's story is not about revenge. It is about what happens when a woman refuses to argue for her value. Serafina did not stay to compete. She did not beg for explanations. She did not threaten exposure. She left, not to punish him, to reclaim herself. Ryland believed she would cool down, return, negotiate, accept apologies wrapped in urgency. He underestimated clarity, because the next move he never saw coming was not dramatic. It was strategic. She did not disappear to hide. She disappeared to build. And when a woman rebuilds herself instead of chasing answers, the balance of power shifts quietly. So the real question is not whether he regretted the mistake. The real question is, what happens when the person you took for granted becomes someone you must now earn again? Stay with me, because this is not a story about a broken marriage. It is a story about transformation. Welcome to Love Tales with Mr. Easton. If you believe love should be intentional, not assumed, you're in the right place. Here, we tell stories about choices, about consequences, about people who lose something important and decide whether to grow or to repeat the pattern. If you value slow-burning romance, honest accountability, and relationships rebuilt with clarity, take a moment now to subscribe, like this video, and stay with this story until the end. It may challenge you. It may reflect something you've lived. Now let's step back calmly. Before the ring touched the marble counter, before sunrise carried her away, there was a man who built his life on control. And there was a woman who believed in impact over optics. To understand why she walked away without shouting, you have to understand who they were before everything cracked. Let's begin there. Ryland Cross built his reputation long before he built his marriage. At 38, he ran Cross Meridian Holdings with the same rhythm he applied to his mornings. Wake at 5, gym by 5:30, black coffee at 6:15, inbox cleared before 8. Every block of his day had purpose. His Chicago office reflected that discipline. Glass walls, neutral tones, no personal clutter, contracts aligned in identical folders, a calendar planned weeks ahead. Staff respected him because he was predictable, not warm, not cold, consistent. He valued efficiency. If a meeting could be done in 20 minutes, it would not last 21. If a partnership failed to meet numbers, it ended. He did not linger in indecision. Control to him meant stability. He grew up watching instability, a father who took risks without planning, a mother who adjusted constantly. He decided early that he would never live reactively. He would anticipate, forecast, manage outcomes before they managed him. Employees described him as steady. Investors described him as reliable. Competitors described him as difficult to outmaneuver. Very few described him as emotionally open. Ryland believed feelings were private matters. They did not belong in boardrooms or negotiations. He did not dismiss emotion. He simply compartmentalized it. To him, love would follow the same logic. Choose carefully. Commit fully. Maintain structure. He had no intention of falling for someone unpredictable. He did not realize that the woman who would challenge his projections would also challenge his internal architecture. At that stage in his life, Ryland believed mastery came from managing variables. He had not yet learned that the heart refuses spreadsheets. Ryland approached relationships the way he approached contracts, with clarity and caution. He did not date casually. He evaluated compatibility like alignment of goals, shared ambition, financial literacy, emotional stability. He preferred calm personalities. Drama wasted time. When he spoke, his tone remained measured. He did not raise his voice. He did not overshare. If conflict arose, he resolved it quickly. Closure mattered to him more than expression. Friends admired his composure, yet some quietly observed that he rarely revealed what unsettled him. To Ryland, composure equaled strength. He believed that if he provided consistency, loyalty would follow naturally. If he showed up physically, that was enough. Emotional transparency seemed excessive. Why discuss insecurity if you could eliminate its cause? Why unpack fear if you could control circumstances? He did not understand that intimacy thrives on openness, not optimization. His previous relationships ended respectfully but without depth. Partners described him as dependable, yet distant. He heard the feedback but did not internalize it. From his perspective, stability was the highest form of affection. When pressure increased at work, he absorbed it quietly. He did not bring stress home. He believed shielding his partner from tension was considerate. What he failed to recognize was that distance can form even without conflict. Precision is effective in business. In love, it can feel like restraint. When Serafina entered his orbit, she sensed both his steadiness and his guarded center. She did not run from it. She challenged it. And that challenge intrigued him more than admiration ever had. They met at a city redevelopment panel hosted in a modest community hall, not a grand venue. Local leaders discussed revitalizing underserved neighborhoods. Ryland presented logistics projections and infrastructure models with polished confidence. Serafina Cade listened from the second row, taking notes. When the floor opened for questions, she stood. "You've calculated projected revenue," she said calmly. "But what metric are you using for long-term community impact?" The room shifted. Ryland paused. No one interrupted his data publicly. She was not confrontational. Her tone carried clarity, not hostility. He answered carefully. She countered with examples from non-profit case studies. The exchange remained respectful yet direct. Afterward, instead of dismissing her, he approached her. "You're thorough," he said. "You're efficient," she replied. "But efficiency without inclusion can displace people." That conversation extended past the event. They spoke about small businesses, supply chains, mentorship programs. She valued growth that protected communities. He valued growth that ensured scalability. Their philosophies differed, but neither felt threatened. He noticed how she listened fully before responding. She did not soften her opinions around his status. She did not attempt to impress him. He admired that restraint. Attraction did not spark from appearance alone. It came from friction that remained respectful. Later that night, he researched her nonprofit work. Youth entrepreneurship workshops, local artisan partnerships, transparent funding models. She operated with conviction. He found himself replaying her voice in his head. For a man who rarely pursued unpredictability, he felt drawn to the one person who did not adjust herself to accommodate him. And for the first time in years, he wanted something that could not be calculated. Their second meeting occurred at a planning session for a redevelopment grant. Ryland proposed consolidating smaller distributors under one centralized contract to reduce cost. Serafina disagreed. Centralization reduces overhead, she acknowledged, but it also removes autonomy from local owners. Autonomy doesn't matter if they can't survive, he countered. It matters if survival costs identity. Their debate continued for nearly an hour. Neither raised their voice. Neither conceded easily. Observers watched closely. Some expected tension to sour the interaction. Instead, it sharpened mutual respect. After the meeting, they walked outside together. "You don't hesitate to challenge me," he said. "You don't hesitate to defend your position," she replied. "Does that bother you?" "No. It makes me want better arguments." He smiled slightly. Conflict, when grounded in principle, can attract two disciplined minds. They were not fighting each other, they were testing frameworks. In that clash, Ryland felt something unfamiliar. He enjoyed being questioned. Most people deferred to him. She did not. He invited her to coffee to continue the discussion. She agreed, but clarified it was still about the project. He respected the boundary. That night, he reflected on their exchange more than any contract negotiation that week. She challenged him without diminishing him. He began to consider the possibility that emotional growth might require friction, not comfort. Their connection was forming on intellectual equality, and that foundation mattered. Ryland did not rush. He studied what mattered to her. She preferred handwritten notes to expensive gestures. She loved walking through quiet neighborhoods at night, observing storefronts and imagining improvements. She valued consistency over spectacle. He adapted carefully, not artificially. He sent her articles related to her nonprofit interests, with thoughtful comments. He showed up to community workshops without announcing his presence. He asked questions about her programs without trying to lead them. His pursuit was deliberate. He did not overwhelm her with grand displays. Instead, he offered stability. He showed up when he said he would. He followed through on commitments. Serafina noticed. "You're steady," she told her brother Tobias one evening. "But guarded." Tobias frowned. "Guarded men require patience." "I'm not afraid of patience," she replied. Ryland began integrating her values into his thinking. He revised projections to include community retention metrics. He invited her feedback before finalizing local contracts. Not because she demanded it, because he respected it. Their dates were simple. Coffee shops, long walks, shared meals cooked at home. They talked about childhood influences, fears, ambitions. He revealed little at first, but gradually more. Not dramatic confessions, subtle disclosures. He told her about his father's failed ventures, about the pressure he felt to avoid similar mistakes. She listened without judgment. Trust began forming through repetition, not intensity. And for a man who believed in structure, this kind of slow construction felt natural. The first time he kissed her, it was in her apartment kitchen. They had just finished preparing dinner together. Dishes soaked in the sink. Soft music played from her phone on the counter. She reached for a towel. He stepped closer. There was no urgency, no dramatic build. He placed his hand lightly on her waist, not pulling, waiting. She looked up at him. He paused deliberately, giving her room to move away if she wished. She did not. He leaned in slowly. Their lips met gently. The kiss carried awareness rather than impulse. It deepened slightly, then paused. He rested his forehead against hers. "I don't rush what matters," he said quietly. She smiled. Good. The moment did not escalate recklessly. It lingered in stillness. He kissed her again, softer this time, tracing her jaw with restrained affection. His hands remained respectful, steady at her waist. Intimacy felt earned, not assumed. That night, she told Tobias about him. "He's careful," she said. "Sometimes too careful." "Careful can be safe," Tobias replied. "Just make sure he doesn't hide behind it." She considered that. In the kitchen, Ryland had demonstrated patience. But patience alone does not guarantee vulnerability. Still, in that early stage, what worked between them was mutual restraint paired with growing warmth. They were building something intentional, and it felt solid. Tobias Cade had built his hardware supply store from scratch. No investors, no corporate backing, just long hours and discipline. He respected effort. Titles did not impress him. When Ryland first met Tobias, the interaction was polite but measured. Tobias shook his hand firmly and observed more than he spoke. "You treat my sister well?" Tobias asked directly. "I intend to," Ryland replied. "Intent isn't action." "I understand." Tobias watched how Ryland interacted with Serafina during dinner. Did he interrupt her? Did he dismiss her ideas? Did he dominate conversation? He did none of those things. Ryland asked Tobias about his business challenges. He listened. He offered insight without condescension. That earned cautious approval. Later, Tobias pulled Serafina aside. "He's disciplined," he said. "But disciplined men can mistake control for care." "I won't let that happen," she replied. Tobias trusted her judgment more than his own suspicion. He loved his sister fiercely, not possessively, but protectively. He wanted her partner to respect her independence, not absorb it. At that stage, Ryland seemed aligned with that expectation. The foundation of their relationship rested on 3 pillars: intellectual respect, steady affection, and mutual ambition. What worked before the cracks formed was real, and that reality would make the later fracture more painful, because nothing about their beginning was careless. It was built carefully, and that is why its disruption would matter so deeply. The proposal was as private as Ryland had ever intended it to be. Serafina had often hinted that she didn't care for grand gestures. She wasn't someone who would post an engagement announcement online or parade a ring on social media. To her, love wasn't about the audience. It was about the quiet, consistent promise of shared futures. So, when Ryland finally decided it was time to ask her to marry him, he took her by surprise, but not with a public spectacle. They were in the living room of the townhouse they had spent months renovating together. The walls were freshly painted, the floors smooth beneath their feet, and there was a comfortable air of intimacy in the space they were building. He had asked her to come over after work to look at something in the house, just a regular Tuesday evening. There was no fancy dinner, no bouquet of roses. Just the two of them, standing in the soft light of the kitchen, surrounded by a life they had already begun to build. He knelt in front of her, his voice steady and clear, not demanding but sincere. "I don't want to win at life without you standing next to me." The simplicity of the moment was what made it powerful. There was no overwhelming crescendo of music, no dazzling lights, just the quiet strength of Ryland, showing the vulnerability that had never quite reached the surface before. She said yes immediately, without hesitation, not because the moment was perfect, but because she felt it, his commitment, his steadiness. He had chosen her, just as she had chosen him. The ring, simple but elegant, slipped onto her finger. It wasn't just a symbol of their union. It was a statement, an unspoken promise that this marriage would be grounded in something deeper than the flash of a proposal. There was something undeniably grounding in the process of renovating their townhouse. It was not an extravagant project, no million-dollar redesigns or high-end materials. Instead, they focused on making a home that fit them both, one where small decisions built trust and intimacy. The house became more than just walls and ceilings. It became a reflection of who they were as individuals and as a couple. Ryland was methodical as ever in this process. He designed everything down to the last detail, often double-checking measurements and materials to ensure that nothing was out of place. But Serafina, with her passion for community and people, reminded him of the warmth that needed to fill those walls. They chose the paint colors together, debated over the furniture styles, and spent weekends hunting for unique finds at local thrift shops. Her influence softened his precision, and his steadiness brought structure to her creativity. It wasn't about who had the better idea, it was about merging their thoughts and making their space a true partnership. The weekends spent on the house were full of small, quiet moments. Sometimes they worked in silence, each absorbed in their tasks. Other times, they would share stories about their childhoods as they carried in furniture or built bookshelves. These moments built something that no amount of wealth could create, a real, lasting connection. The townhouse wasn't just a home, it was the foundation they laid down together. In the early months of marriage, there was a quiet softness between them, like the feeling of walking barefoot on freshly mopped floors. It wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't dramatic, but it was constant. They spent nights on the couch together, Serafina reading a book while Ryland worked on his laptop, the background hum of their lives blending seamlessly. There were no grand romantic declarations. Instead, Ryland would sometimes glance at her over the rim of his coffee cup, his eyes softening in appreciation when she wasn't looking. At the end of every workday, Ryland would come home, change into something comfortable, and sit at the kitchen table while Serafina cooked dinner. He had learned to appreciate these quiet routines. They didn't need extravagant dates or attention-grabbing moments. What mattered was how she fit into his life, how naturally her presence calmed him after long, stressful days at the office. Their mornings were equally simple, yet no less meaningful. Ryland would grab his coffee, and Serafina would slip into the space next to him, her hand brushing his as they shared fleeting smiles. There were no expectations of romance, just mutual respect and a gentle understanding that they were building a life together, brick by brick. Their emotional intimacy wasn't loud or attention-grabbing. It was the comfort of knowing someone's habits, the way Serafina preferred her eggs, or how Ryland hummed his favorite song in the shower. These small things, unnoticed by others, were the foundation of their connection. Their domestic life was built on tiny yet meaningful acts of care that spoke louder than any grand gesture. There was the way Serafina would leave a handwritten note for Ryland on the kitchen counter, folded neatly, telling him she loved him, or how he'd surprise her with her favorite breakfast, a fruit bowl with just the right combination of melon and berries. Sometimes it was the unspoken, like when Ryland would automatically fill her coffee cup as soon as she entered the kitchen, without asking, or how she would pause to listen when he vented about a particularly difficult negotiation. Evenings often found them in the kitchen together, one of them cooking while the other cleaned or prepped the next part of the meal. They didn't talk much during these moments, but their shared silence was comfortable. It was understanding. It was the kind of closeness that didn't require words. Their conversations about small things, like whether or not they should repaint the hallway, became shared projects that anchored their connection. They didn't need constant verbal exchanges to feel close. It was the consistent presence that mattered most. They both knew how to give space to each other, yet the connection was always there, subtle but firm. These quiet, everyday moments were the glue holding their marriage together, even before either of them realized that things were starting to change. As Cross-Meridian Holdings continued to expand, so did the pressure on Ryland. The company had reached a critical point. Its international expansion into emerging markets was lucrative but complex. Investors were excited about the potential, but they also demanded speed. It wasn't enough to meet expectations anymore. They wanted fast results. Ryland found himself consumed by the growth of the company. He spent more nights in the office, more time on planes, more energy in meetings. The expansion required meticulous attention to detail, and he couldn't afford to let anything slip. Every contract, every partnership, every investor meeting had to be flawless. But the further he drove the company, the further he drifted from Serafina. His focus on corporate success became a slow, insidious force, edging into their time together. What used to be quiet evenings spent in their townhouse now became rushed phone calls and last-minute meetings. Serafina noticed it before he did. His absence wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He had always been somewhat distant, but this was different. He was no longer just busy. He was absent in ways that couldn't be explained away by work. He didn't know it yet, but the growing distance between them wasn't just a byproduct of his ambition. It was a symptom of something deeper that was starting to form under the surface. Corinne Williams arrived at Cross Meridian Holdings with a sharp focus and even sharper instincts. At 29, she was ambitious, quick-witted, and had a natural flair for public relations. She understood how to create the perfect narrative. She could spin a story with precision, making even the most mundane project seem like a high-profile success. Her previous roles in communications had shown her how to work with top-tier clients, and Ryland saw her as an invaluable asset to the expanding company. Their relationship began professionally, of course. Late meetings, strategic dinners, and travel coordination. But over time, something shifted. Corinne knew how to flatter Ryland, how to draw out his opinions without overstepping boundaries. She knew how to make him feel seen in ways that felt just a little different than how Serafina did. It wasn't overt, at least not at first, but Corinne had a way of navigating his space with ease. She made sure that when Ryland was under pressure, she was there, ready to take on tasks and ease his burden. Ryland appreciated Corinne's efficiency. She was a natural fit for the company, and her work ethic was impressive. But Serafina noticed. She saw the late nights they spent together discussing strategies, the quick, casual mentions of PR handling it in his conversations. Something felt off, but she didn't want to overreact. She believed in trust, and trust wasn't something she had ever doubted. However, as time went on, the subtle signs were too clear to ignore. The shifts in Ryland's schedule didn't happen overnight, but they were undeniable. At first, it was just one late meeting a week. Then two. Then, he was flying out for client meetings on weekends. Serafina did her best to remain supportive. She knew that Ryland's company was expanding rapidly, and she respected his work ethic. But as the weeks passed, the evenings alone grew longer. Her questions, though often masked as curiosity, began to feel like an intrusion. "Another late dinner?" she asked one evening, trying to sound casual. "It's expansion season," he replied, his tone dismissive. "You knew this would be intense." She nodded, but something in her stomach twisted. She had supported him from the beginning, never wanting to be the wife who resented his ambition. But now, the distance wasn't just about time. It was about attention. Conversations, once filled with curiosity about each other's day, had been reduced to quick updates and it went well summaries. Ryland was closing deals. He was securing contracts, but the personal connection they once shared was no longer growing. It was stagnating. The emotional exclusion had begun subtly, but it had taken root. Have you ever sensed emotional distance before the evidence appeared? Have you ever found yourself asking if something was slipping, but not knowing exactly when or how? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Ryland was too focused on work? Or did Serafina's own internal conflict play a role in the growing distance? Let's talk about it. Serafina had spent the evening quietly moving about the kitchen, preparing dinner. She didn't expect anything unusual that night. Ryland had been busy with the latest expansion meetings and had promised to be home in time for a late meal, but she had grown used to the unpredictable timing of his work. It had become a part of their routine. He would walk in after a long day, and she would already be in the kitchen, the air filled with the smell of whatever they were cooking. The phone lay on the kitchen counter, its screen casting a faint light. She hadn't thought much of it at first. After all, Ryland always left his phone around. He'd never been particularly secretive about his messages, and there had been no need to check his device. But this time, as she set the last of the plates on the table, her eyes were drawn to it. It wasn't anything glaring at first, just a flash of text as the phone buzzed. "Last night meant more than you know." Serafina's heart skipped, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't the type of message that left room for interpretation. There was no mistaking what it meant. Her instinct was to ignore it, to let it go. Maybe it was something unrelated, but her eyes were locked on the words, the phrase repeating in her mind, over and over again. She didn't move immediately. The tension hung in the air, thick and almost suffocating. She stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the phone, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. Her hand moved slowly to the phone. Her fingers brushed against the cool surface, and she didn't need to unlock it. The message was still visible in the notification preview. "Last night meant more than you know." Serafina's heart pounded in her chest. The words repeated again and again in her mind. The message was clearly not intended for her, and it was certainly not something innocent. Her hands felt clammy, but there was something in her that resisted the urge to run and confront him immediately. Instead, she allowed herself to breathe, forcing herself to take a step back and assess her emotions. But the more she tried to calm herself, the clearer it became. Ryland was keeping something from her. She had trusted him implicitly, believed in their partnership, their commitment to one another. They had built something together. A life, a marriage. She had trusted him with everything. But now that trust was unraveling, thread by thread. She couldn't bring herself to reach out for the phone, though the temptation to confront him right then and there was powerful. But something inside her told her to wait, to hold off until he came out of the shower, to let him explain it in his own time. It was as if the silence between them had already become heavy with expectation. She would not rush. She would not give him the satisfaction of an immediate response. Instead, she allowed the message to sit between them. She set the phone down, but her mind was already reeling. The sound of the water running in the shower was a constant hum in the background. Serafina moved quietly around the kitchen, finishing the meal and setting it on the table. She tried to keep her movements casual, but inside, her mind was racing. Her thoughts were a storm she couldn't quiet. When the sound of the water stopped, and she heard the soft shuffle of his footsteps approaching, her pulse quickened. This was the moment. The question that had lodged itself deep within her, this feeling of doubt, of betrayal, was about to be answered. He emerged from the bathroom, his hair still damp, wearing nothing but a towel. His eyes caught hers immediately. There was no warmth there, no softness, just a flicker of curiosity. He didn't see it coming. Serafina stood still for a moment, her hands resting at her sides, trying to steady herself. But the air between them was charged now, and she couldn't pretend anymore. She was no longer just his wife waiting for dinner. She was the woman who had seen something she shouldn't have, something that demanded an answer. Her voice, steady and low, broke the silence. What did last night mean? He paused, not quite meeting her gaze, his eyes flickering toward the phone. His breath caught as he realized the words she was referring to. "It's not what you think," he replied quickly, his tone defensive, the words coming out too quickly. Serafina felt a chill settle deep in her chest. The words were familiar, like a rehearsed line, and the hesitation that fraction of a second before his response, it said more than anything he could have admitted. Her grip on the counter tightened. "Then tell me what it is," she insisted, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a blade. Ryland shifted uncomfortably, his eyes moving away from hers, searching for an explanation. The words were already there, but the weight of his hesitation told her more than anything else could. It was a mistake," he said. But the words didn't sound convincing. It wasn't just the apology he was offering. It was the way he avoided her gaze. It was the way he hesitated before speaking. The pause told her everything. She had seen it in his eyes, the lie that he didn't want to admit. A mistake. That was his explanation. A mistake. She swallowed the lump in her throat. That was all she was worth in his eyes. A mistake to him was an excuse, an easy out. But the deeper issue was not about what happened, but how he treated her in the moments before the confession. Her voice shook as she spoke, but she held herself steady. "A mistake," she repeated, the disbelief cutting through her words. "A moment?" He nodded, still not meeting her eyes. The answer didn't feel real to her. It felt rehearsed, a defense he used to hide the truth, to mask what had truly happened. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was sorry he'd been caught. The hesitation had exposed everything. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ryland stood there, unsure of how to proceed. He was waiting for her to speak, but Serafina was frozen in place, her eyes locked on him. And then, just as she thought she might break down, something in her snapped. She couldn't hold it in any longer. The flood of emotions that had been building for days, weeks even, surged to the surface. Her voice broke as she asked, "You betrayed me." The words didn't come out gently. They tore through her chest, sharp and painful. The depth of the hurt, the weight of the betrayal, felt unbearable. His face tightened, the hint of guilt flickering in his eyes. But it wasn't enough. It was too late for apologies, too late for explanations. She had trusted him, had given him her all, her love, her time, her commitment, and he had turned that into a lie. Her voice trembled as she continued, barely able to form the words. "You broke something I can't fix," she whispered, the sorrow heavy in her throat. Ryland stepped forward, his hand reaching out toward her, but she recoiled instinctively. It wasn't out of anger, it was out of self-preservation. She couldn't let him touch her in that moment. Serafina's hands were trembling as she moved to the counter. She looked down at her hand, the weight of the wedding band pressing against her skin. The ring that had once been a symbol of love, of trust, now felt like a weight she could no longer carry. With deliberate precision, she removed the ring from her finger, her heart breaking as she did it. There was no grand gesture, no shouting. She simply took it off and placed it on the marble counter, her fingers tracing the smooth surface as if she were marking the end of something once beautiful. Ryland watched, his expression shifting from disbelief to guilt, but he said nothing. His hesitation had already betrayed him. "I will not compete for my own marriage," she said quietly, the words cutting through the silence. And in that moment she knew she wasn't just walking away from the man she loved. She was walking away from a version of herself that had allowed her love to be taken for granted. Her voice was steady now, even if her heart wasn't. She would not stay in a marriage built on assumption and neglect. The woman she was now could not return to what they had been, not without change, not without him proving he understood what he had lost. Without another word, she walked upstairs. The sound of her footsteps was soft but determined. Each step was a silent goodbye, a final movement toward independence. She opened the closet, pulling out the suitcase they had once packed together for weekend getaways. She didn't take much, just a few items of clothing, some essentials, but the act of packing felt heavy. It felt like the last vestige of the life they had built, packed away in a single suitcase. She didn't rush. She folded each piece of clothing carefully, methodically, the way Ryland would have done. But this was different. There was no sense of precision now. She was no longer trying to control her emotions. She was releasing them. When the suitcase was packed, she stood in the doorway for a moment, looking around the room they had shared. The room that had once been filled with laughter, with love, now felt empty. Serafina didn't glance back. She picked up her bag and left. It was still dark when she stepped outside, the cool night air hitting her skin as she walked to her car. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sounds being the distant hum of city life and the rustling of leaves in the wind. She didn't look back. The car's headlights illuminated the road ahead, cutting through the darkness. She drove in silence, her mind racing with thoughts, but none of them about Ryland. The pain of the betrayal had not fully settled, but the clarity had. She was leaving, not to punish him, but to reclaim herself, to find the woman she had been before her marriage had consumed her. The sunrise broke over the horizon as she reached her destination. She didn't know exactly what came next, but for the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. Her journey had just begun. The drive was long but not uncomfortable. Serafina's mind was in overdrive, but the steady rhythm of the road, the hum of the tires against asphalt, gave her a strange sense of calm. The city was behind her now, its noise, its distractions, its weight. The skyline faded as the streets grew quieter, the buildings shorter, and the air crisper. She didn't know what to expect when she reached the small lake town, but the peacefulness it promised was a welcome relief. When she arrived, she didn't know exactly where to go first, but as she made her way through the sleepy streets, her eyes caught the storefront of an old abandoned bookstore. The sign was faded, the windows slightly fogged, but there was something oddly inviting about it. It felt like the kind of place that held stories not just of books, but of lives lived quietly and purposefully. She parked outside and took a deep breath, gathering herself. There was no one to greet her, no one to judge her decision, no one who knew her as Ryland's wife. Here she was just Serafina. She had no roles to play. She wasn't trying to fit into expectations or follow a script. She moved upstairs to a small, modest apartment above the bookstore. The space was nothing extravagant. It was simple, functional, with a single window that faced the lake. A quiet, reflective space. She unpacked the few belongings she had brought with her, enough to live comfortably, but nothing that would remind her of the life she had just left behind. Here, she wasn't seeking solace in distractions. She was seeking space to breathe. The apartment was tiny, but it was hers, and that ownership brought a sense of unexpected empowerment. The walls were painted a soft beige, and the hardwood floors creaked underfoot, but there was a certain charm in the imperfection. The furniture was simple: a bed, a small table, a chair by the window, and a worn rug in the center of the room. The kitchen was basic, but functional. For the first time in what felt like forever, Serafina felt a quiet peace settle in. She didn't need more than this. She had always lived in spaces full of potential. Big homes, grand kitchens, spaces where she had spent years filling with the promises of a life she had assumed would stay intact. But in this small town, in this modest apartment, she found something that no grand house could give her: space to think. Her gaze often drifted out the window to the lake, the water still and serene. The quiet hum of the small town below felt comforting, a stark contrast to the whirlwind she had just left behind. Serafina spent the first few days in the apartment unpacking and organizing, but also reflecting. She didn't push herself to do anything extraordinary. For the first time in years, she wasn't required to be anything or anyone for anyone else. She wasn't a wife, a partner, a supporter. She was just Serafina, and for a while, that felt enough. In the quiet of the apartment, Serafina slipped into isolation. It wasn't just physical isolation, it was emotional too. She didn't reach out to anyone. She didn't call her friends. She didn't connect with her family. Not yet. She had given so much of herself for so long, emotionally, mentally, even physically, that the absence of constant demands felt disorienting at first. But soon, she realized that she needed this space. She needed to be alone with her thoughts, with her feelings. She needed to untangle the mess inside her heart, the knots of doubt, the sense of failure, the anger at Ryland, and the deep, aching sadness of being betrayed. For days, Serafina simply existed. She didn't rush to make any decisions. She didn't set goals or try to create a new purpose. She allowed herself to feel what she needed to feel. She stayed in her small apartment, reading books, walking around the lake, and sleeping. The world outside was in motion, but in this space, time moved slowly. Her isolation wasn't about avoiding her problems. It was about creating space to heal. She had been too busy being everything for everyone else for too long. Now she needed to be everything for herself. The only person she allowed herself to communicate with was Tobias. He was the only person who hadn't let her down, the only person who understood the depths of her pain without needing to offer solutions. In the stillness, the doubts crept in. Serafina couldn't stop herself from questioning every choice she had made. Had she been too trusting? Had she been too patient? Did she overlook signs, waiting for Ryland to come around, believing that the man she loved would eventually find his way back to her? She sat by the window late one evening, the fading light of the day stretching across the water, and wondered about the life she had walked away from. Did she make the right choice? Was she too hasty in leaving? Should she have fought harder for their marriage, tried to rebuild it before walking away? The doubts came and went, but they never fully left her. She had chosen to walk away, but the fear of what might happen next, what would become of her, of them, of everything they had, lingered. But deep down, a quiet voice reminded her, healing doesn't happen when you stay in the place that hurt you. It happens when you step outside of it, even if it's into the unknown. The doubt was a natural part of her healing process, but she knew that staying in it would only hold her back. The most difficult part of her isolation was facing herself. Serafina had always been defined by the roles she played: Ryland's wife, a mentor to local businesses, an advocate for small community growth. She was the one who kept the wheels of everything moving smoothly. But who was she when those roles were no longer there? When she looked in the mirror now, she didn't see the woman who had once been so certain. She didn't see the person who had walked into her marriage with optimism, with a heart full of dreams. She saw someone who had been worn down by compromise, by the weight of someone else's ambitions, by the erosion of self that had come with being everything to everyone except herself. She didn't want to look back on her life and see it as a series of sacrifices, of compromises, of moments where she had lost herself to make space for someone else. And yet, there she was, alone, with no clear sense of who she was outside of those roles. Her mind wandered to the woman she had been before Ryland, before the marriage, before the expectations. She had been independent, driven, full of passion for the work she did in the community. She had believed in impact. She had believed in changing lives for the better. But somewhere along the way, she had stopped believing in herself. Now, she was searching for that woman again. She was searching for the part of herself that had been lost in the blur of marital duties and corporate pressures. She began asking herself, not who am I, but who do I want to be? And in that question, the seeds of her transformation were planted. The phone call with Tobias was the only form of communication Serafina allowed herself in those early days. He had always been her rock, her protector. When their parents had been too busy or too wrapped up in their own lives, Tobias had stepped in. He had always been there, always understanding, never judging. But even Tobias couldn't fully comprehend the depth of the turmoil she was going through. She hadn't shared all the details of Ryland's betrayal with him. She wasn't ready to rehash the specifics. But Tobias understood the unspoken pain in her voice. "I'm safe," she told him one evening when he called, his voice filled with concern. "I know," Tobias replied, his tone steady but worried. "You're stronger than you think. Just don't keep everything to yourself, okay?" She paused, her heart tightening. She had always been the strong one, the one who carried everyone else's burdens. But now, she was the one who needed to lean on someone. And Tobias had always been there, ready to catch her when she fell. "Don't tell Ryland where I am," she said quietly. He hesitated, but didn't argue. "I won't. But you're not alone in this, Serafina. Remember that." As the days stretched on, Serafina began to channel her energy into something productive. She didn't just want to heal. She wanted to build. She wanted to create something that would bring purpose back into her life. Her experience in nonprofit work had shown her the power of community-driven change. Small businesses, local artisans, family-owned stores. These were the lifeblood of the communities she loved. She had seen firsthand how the logistics of supply chains could cripple these businesses, leaving them struggling to survive. What if she could help? What if she could create a system that allowed these small businesses to thrive, without having to give up their independence to larger corporations? The idea formed slowly, quietly, in the back of her mind. A cooperative that could allow small businesses to access shared resources, distribution networks, bulk purchasing, and transparent pricing, without losing their identity. She started making calls, reaching out to small shops in the area, gauging their interest. The idea wasn't fully formed yet, but she could feel the possibility. She could see it taking shape. For the first time in months, she felt the spark of purpose reignite within her. It wasn't just about building something for herself. It was about rebuilding the community she had always believed in, one small step at a time. The meeting was small, the room dimly lit, with no more than a handful of chairs filled by local shop owners and community leaders. Serafina stood at the front, her hand lightly resting on a stack of papers, her back straight, her posture confident but calm. The room smelled faintly of old wood and freshly brewed coffee. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of purpose settle in her chest. It wasn't the grand vision she once had for her life, or the certainty she had shared with Ryland about their future together. It was simpler than that. It was about real, tangible change. She was not here to impress or prove anything. She was here to help. "We're at a tipping point," she began, her voice clear and firm. "Many of you are small business owners. The last few years have been hard. The economy, supply chain disruptions, and rising costs are making it even harder. But we can come together to change that." Her words hung in the air, filling the space with the weight of shared struggle. She wasn't offering charity or handouts. She was offering collaboration, a partnership. The idea of a cooperative, small businesses joining forces to share resources, lower costs, and amplify their reach, was something she had toyed with before, but now it was real. Serafina could see it on the faces of the shop owners, the cautious curiosity, the skepticism. They had been burned before. They had tried many things that didn't work, and they had learned to expect little, but there was something about her that made them listen. She wasn't offering easy solutions. She was offering hope, real, hard work. And for the first time in months, Serafina felt like she was standing on the edge of something that could change everything. The reality of small businesses was not lost on Serafina. She had seen firsthand the challenges these owners faced: chronic underfunding, long hours, and constant pressure to compete against larger corporations with bottomless budgets. But what truly struck her was the sense of isolation they endured. These were passionate individuals who had poured their blood, sweat, and tears into their work. Yet they often found themselves alone, struggling to make ends meet, and feeling disconnected from any real support system. In the meetings she attended, she heard it all: the long nights, the overwhelming paperwork, the feeling of being unheard by local governments and larger corporations that dominated the market. There were whispers of bankruptcy, of struggling to keep the doors open, of wondering if their hard work would ever pay off. But Serafina wasn't just listening, she was learning. She had always been an advocate for community-driven change, but now it was personal. She knew these people. She understood their concerns. She had seen the toll it took on their spirits. They didn't need a savior. They needed someone who believed in their ability to thrive. As she sat in the back of those meetings, taking notes, observing, she realized how deeply entrenched these problems were. The businesses weren't just struggling financially, they were struggling emotionally too. The isolation they felt, the constant weight of trying to do everything alone, it was stifling. But now she had a vision, a way to bring them together. She would build a cooperative, not just a business model, but a community, one based on shared values and collective action. Serafina knew that launching the cooperative wouldn't be easy. The concept was sound, but turning it into a reality meant overcoming 1,000 hurdles. She began drafting plans, gathering data, reaching out to people who might be interested in joining the initiative. She spent countless hours researching how to structure the cooperative, what the legal requirements would be, and how to make it financially sustainable. The first step was securing the buy-in from local shop owners. She needed them to see the value in pooling their resources, in sharing their knowledge and their networks. Some were more receptive than others, but each meeting she attended felt like a step in the right direction. By the end of the month, she had enough local interest to hold a formal launch meeting. She presented the concept again, this time with more detail, financial models, projections, and case studies from other successful cooperatives. She addressed every question, every concern, and by the end of the evening, more than half of the business owners agreed to join. The first cooperative meeting was held in the back of the bookstore where she lived, the same small room where she had been spending most of her time. It was symbolic, she realized. This was where she had found herself again, where she was starting over. Now, she was inviting others to begin their own transformation. The first steps were small: consolidating purchasing power, negotiating bulk discounts, sharing logistical resources. But Serafina could feel the energy building. She wasn't just creating a cooperative, she was creating a community. As the days passed, the weight of her new responsibilities began to take a physical toll on Serafina. The late nights, the endless meetings, the never-ending stream of emails and phone calls, they all began to blur together. She was working harder than she had ever worked before, but it wasn't the kind of work that drained her spirit. It was the kind of work that gave her a renewed sense of purpose. But there were moments when exhaustion took over. She would wake up in the morning, groggy from a few hours of sleep, and then push herself through another 12-hour day. Her body ached from the long hours spent standing, from the constant movement, from the weight of carrying everyone's expectations. Her muscles felt tight, her back sore, but each night when she sat down to review her progress, she couldn't help but smile. She had started something real. It wasn't perfect. There were still plenty of challenges to face, but it was happening. She was doing something that mattered, something that could make a tangible difference in the lives of people who had never had anyone fight for them before. Still, there were moments when the exhaustion hit hard. She would sit at her small desk, her head leaning against the cool wood of the bookshelf, and she would close her eyes for just a moment, letting the weight of it all wash over her. But then, something would click. A new idea, a new piece of the puzzle, and she would get up again, driven by the knowledge that the work she was doing was worth every ounce of effort. There was a distinct moment when Serafina felt the shift. It wasn't the first time someone signed up for the cooperative, or the first successful meeting. It wasn't a moment of grand success. It was a moment of quiet realization. She had been sitting in the bookstore one morning, reviewing financials for the cooperative, when it hit her. She wasn't just working to survive anymore. She was working to create something that could last, something that could truly make an impact. It was the kind of work she had always dreamed of doing, but had never found a way to fully realize. In that moment, Serafina realized something important. This wasn't just about the cooperative. It was about her own growth, her own transformation. She had walked away from a life that had drained her, that had left her feeling small and unsure. But now, she was building something that was entirely hers, something that had no connection to anyone else's expectations. The purpose wasn't just external, it was internal. It was a way of reclaiming herself, of reasserting her value, her worth, her autonomy. She was no longer defined by the roles others had imposed on her. She was defining herself. This realization was small but profound. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about proving it to herself. She had started over, not just because she had to, but because she wanted to. For the first time in a long while, Serafina thought about what intimacy really meant. It wasn't the emotional distance she had felt with Ryland. It wasn't the kind of intimacy that comes from long, romantic dinners or passionate declarations of love. It wasn't about physical proximity either. It was about shared purpose. It was about working together towards something meaningful. The bond she formed with the small business owners in the cooperative was not just professional. It was deeply personal. They trusted her with their challenges, their fears, their hopes. They came to her for guidance, but they also shared their own wisdom with her. They were in this together, not just because of a business agreement, but because they all had something at stake. Serafina realized that intimacy wasn't just about personal connection, it was about shared mission. She wasn't building the cooperative for herself alone. She was building it for them, for the people who had trusted her with their livelihoods. And in turn, they had trusted her with their hearts. Tobias arrived at the lake town on a weekend visit, as he always did when things were quieter. He had been following Serafina's progress, but he hadn't seen her in person since she had left Chicago. When he arrived at her apartment above the bookstore, he found her sitting by the window, gazing out at the lake. Her face was tired, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. "You look good," Tobias said with a smile. "How are things going?" Serafina smiled, but it was a tired smile. "Better. It's hard work, but it feels right." Tobias sat down beside her, watching the water shimmer in the late afternoon light. "I'm proud of you, sis," he said softly. "I knew you had it in you." Serafina turned to him, her heart swelling with gratitude. She hadn't realized how much she had needed this visit. She had been doing everything for herself, but having Tobias there reminded her that she wasn't alone. And that was the true power of rebuilding, when you realize that the people who love you are the ones who make the journey possible. The contract was the one Ryland had been working toward for months. It was a massive deal, a partnership with a global distributor that would give Cross Meridian Holdings an unprecedented foothold in emerging markets. On paper, it was the crowning achievement of his career, the culmination of years of effort, countless late nights, and strategic dinners. When the deal was finalized, Ryland stood at the head of the boardroom table, surrounded by his team, receiving congratulations from all sides. Everyone praised his leadership, his unwavering focus, his ability to seal the deal. He smiled and nodded, accepting the accolades with the quiet composure he was known for, but inside, there was nothing. No satisfaction, no joy. The victory felt hollow, like a milestone reached without meaning. As the celebratory calls and handshakes continued around him, Ryland couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that something had been lost. It wasn't just the business success. It wasn't the deal itself. It was the fact that despite all his achievements, he was standing there without the one person who had always been by his side. Serafina wasn't there. She hadn't been for weeks, and it was as if, in achieving his greatest success, he had failed to notice the very thing that had made his success meaningful, the partnership they had once shared. The applause faded in his ears, replaced by the echo of empty space in his life. He had built an empire, but it felt like it was crumbling from the inside out. Corinne Williams, who had once been a quiet professional presence in Ryland's life, began to sense a shift. It started subtly, just small things that she picked up on during meetings, dinners, and late-night strategy sessions. At first, she assumed it was just the pressure of the new contract, the late nights, the constant travel. But as the weeks wore on, the shift became more apparent. Ryland had always been distant, but now he seemed completely closed off. His conversations with her had become more transactional, less personal. He no longer offered the same level of attention he had before, no longer leaned in when she spoke, no longer smiled when she entered a room. She was the only one who noticed it, at least, the only one brave enough to acknowledge it. The other team members praised him more than ever, but Corinne could tell something had changed. There was a hesitation in his eyes that wasn't there before. He was still focused on business, still meticulous in his work, but he wasn't present, not in the way he once was. One night, during a dinner meeting where they were discussing the expansion plans, Corinne spoke up. "You're distracted," she said, leaning forward across the table. "It's not just the business. What's going on with you, Ryland?" He looked at her then, his gaze sharp, almost defensive, but there was a flicker of something that spoke to the cracks forming beneath his calm exterior. "I'm fine," he said, his tone flat, offering no room for further discussion. But Corinne wasn't convinced. The walls he had built around himself were high, and he had sealed himself inside. She didn't press him any further that night, but she knew something had changed. And it wasn't just the business. Corinne's departure was abrupt, though it had been coming for some time. She had been a fixture in Ryland's professional world for nearly a year, and over time, their working relationship had evolved. She had admired his drive, his vision, and his focus. She had seen potential in him that others had missed. And for a while, it had seemed like a perfect partnership. She brought the sharp, strategic mind, and he brought the operational brilliance. They made a great team, both in business and in the shared understanding of how much was at stake. But after weeks of noticing his emotional distance, she began to realize that the partnership they had was not what she had hoped for. She had expected more. A deeper connection perhaps, even a deeper trust. But what she found was someone who had closed off emotionally, someone who had become too absorbed in his own world. The tipping point came one evening when they were both in his office, working late on a presentation for the new deal. Ryland was distracted, flipping through paperwork without really engaging with her. She cleared her throat, trying to get his attention, but it was as if he couldn't hear her. "I can't do this anymore," she said softly, her voice steady but final. "I'm sorry, Ryland, but I can't work with someone who's not here, not really." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at her with an almost unreadable expression. Then with a heavy sigh he said, "I understand." It wasn't a dramatic exit. She didn't storm out, didn't accuse him of anything. She simply handed over her resignation, packed up her things, and walked out. As she left the office for the last time, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The tension, the unspoken distance, it had worn her down. She wasn't angry with him. She just realized that she deserved more than a partnership with someone who had emotionally shut her out. For Ryland, her departure barely registered at first. He was too consumed with his work, too absorbed in his internal turmoil, to notice the absence. But as the days passed, the silence in his office grew louder. Corinne was gone. And for the first time, Ryland was truly alone. Ryland had always prided himself on handling things on his own. Problems were to be solved, not discussed. Issues were for strategizing, not sharing. But as the weeks dragged on and the weight of his isolation grew heavier, he began to question his approach. The absence of Corinne and Serafina left a gap in his life that no amount of professional success could fill. He tried to ignore it at first, burying himself in work, but the emotional fog was relentless. Every time he sat at his desk, a creeping sense of emptiness would take over. His thoughts were consumed with the past, with Serafina's departure, with the way he had treated her, with the failure of his marriage. One evening, after a particularly difficult meeting with investors, Ryland stood in front of his office mirror, staring at his reflection. His face seemed unfamiliar, strained. He had always been a man of control, a man who believed he could fix anything. But now, he realized that he couldn't fix this, not alone. It was then that the idea of therapy crept into his mind. He had never considered it before. He had always seen therapy as something people did when they couldn't handle their own issues. But now, it felt like his only option. If he wanted to salvage anything, whether it was his company, his relationships, or his own sense of self, he knew he needed to start by facing the things he had ignored for so long. The decision was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but it was also the first step in his real journey toward accountability. Ryland's first therapy session was everything he had expected it to be: uncomfortable, awkward, and humbling. The therapist, a calm, middle-aged woman with an empathetic but direct demeanor, guided him through the process. "So, why are you here?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. He hesitated, unsure of how to begin. But then he spoke, slowly, choosing his words with care. "I don't know how to fix what I've broken." The therapist nodded, giving him space to continue. "What exactly do you feel is broken?" Ryland paused. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to truly reflect. my marriage, my relationships, my self-control. I've spent so much time trying to control everything, but I never really understood what I was losing in the process. The conversation went on for hours. He spoke about Serafina, about Corinne, about his childhood, about the pressure he felt to always be perfect. For the first time in years, Ryland allowed himself to be vulnerable, to speak openly about the cracks in his life that he had been ignoring. He left the session feeling exhausted but strangely lighter. Therapy wasn't the quick fix he had hoped for, but it was a start. For the first time, he realized that fixing his life wouldn't be about controlling the outcome. It would be about confronting his own mistakes. Back at Cross Meridian, the tension in the boardroom was palpable. Ryland had spent weeks focused on internal changes, but his company was still pushing forward at breakneck speed. The board was pleased with the results of the new deal, but there was an underlying tension. They had noticed his distraction. His energy had shifted, and no one could deny it. During a quarterly meeting, one of the board members, a longtime ally, addressed him directly. "Ryland," the man said, his voice measured, "you've been a bit off lately. You've been distracted. We need your focus. The company needs its leader back." The words stung, but Ryland didn't flinch. Instead, he took a deep breath and addressed the group. "I've been rethinking things," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. "Our company has thrived on dominance, on speed, but that's not sustainable. We need to shift toward collaboration. We need to start working with our partners, not just for our own gain." The room was silent for a moment. Some of the members exchanged glances. It was clear that this was a departure from the aggressive growth strategy they had adopted for years. But Ryland wasn't backing down. For the first time in months, he wasn't worried about their approval. He was worried about making the right decision. As the meeting concluded, the shift in Ryland's approach became clear. He wasn't going to continue pushing his company forward at any cost. Instead, he proposed a new strategy, one based on collaboration, transparency, and shared success. "We've been focused on expanding at all costs," he said, standing before the board. "But we've forgotten that growth isn't just about numbers. It's about relationships. It's about building something sustainable. We need to build with our partners, not just for ourselves." The board members looked skeptical, but Ryland stood his ground. He wasn't offering a quick fix. He was offering a shift in mindset, a long-term strategy that could redefine the future of Cross Meridian. The meeting ended with mixed reactions. Some were on board with the idea, while others hesitated, unsure of the risks. But Ryland knew one thing for certain: this was the right direction. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, Ryland felt like he was on the right path. Can someone truly change after betrayal, or is trust permanently altered? Let us know in the comments. Do you believe it's possible to rebuild trust after it's been broken? Or is trust something that, once lost, can never truly be regained? Ryland had always prided himself on his ability to anticipate outcomes. But when he sat down at his desk one morning, reviewing the latest batch of proposals, the name in front of him caught him completely off guard. It was her name, Serafina Cade. She was listed as the director of a cooperative proposal from a local supply chain network. A part of him froze, his eyes lingering on the words. He knew that she had been busy building something, but this was something entirely different. It wasn't just a small, independent venture. It was serious, structured, competitive. The proposal was for a partnership, the very same kind of partnership Cross Meridian was seeking for its new regional expansion. She had taken the idea he had been toying with, collaborative, community-based logistics, and turned it into a formalized business model. Her cooperative could potentially disrupt everything he had been working for. Ryland leaned back in his chair, trying to process what he was seeing. For the first time in months, a wave of panic crept up from within him. He had assumed Serafina was just running her small community projects, keeping things local. He never considered she could be plotting a larger move. But now, here it was, a direct competitor to everything he had been doing. He knew she wasn't trying to one-up him. She wasn't playing some game to get back at him. But what stung was the realization that while he had been out of touch, she had been busy carving out her own path, one that could no longer be ignored. The board had been pushing him for results. They wanted the expansion, the partnerships, the domination. But now, one of the key pieces of his business strategy had just become a collision course. Her proposal wasn't just a piece of paperwork. It was a wake-up call. The drive was longer than he expected. The further he got away from Chicago, the heavier the weight on his chest became. Ryland had never considered just driving somewhere to solve a problem. But this was different. The moment he saw Serafina's name on that proposal, everything changed. He had no idea what to expect when he reached her, but he couldn't sit on this. He couldn't wait for the paperwork to unfold, for the proposals to merge into a business meeting. He needed answers. He needed to understand where she was coming from. His mind raced as the landscape around him transformed from the cold steel and glass of Chicago to the rolling hills and quiet lakes of the countryside. The transition felt symbolic, the city fading into the past as he approached the new reality. Ryland thought about their conversations, the way they'd talked about the future, about building something together. But now here he was, racing to catch up with the reality she had built in his absence. He tried to convince himself that he was going to fix things, that his intentions were good. But deep down, he knew there was more to this trip than just professional business. He needed closure. He needed to understand how she could just move forward without him. He reached the small town, his car slowing as he neared the lake. It wasn't a grand destination. It wasn't where he thought he'd find her again. But it was where she had rebuilt herself. Ryland parked by the lake, taking a moment to breathe before he made his way to the bookstore. He couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of his mind, the one that wondered if it was already too late. When Ryland stepped into the shared warehouse facility, he didn't expect the feeling that hit him. The space was modest but organized. It was efficient in a way that felt familiar to him. It wasn't fancy. There were no large conference tables or plush chairs. Just tables lined with documents, shelves filled with inventory, and a clear focus on the work being done. And there, standing by a group of small business owners, was Serafina. Her posture was different now. She was no longer the woman he had married, uncertain, full of hopes but weighed down by the pressures of his world. Now she was something else, grounded, self-assured, with a quiet strength that came from building something of her own. He could tell she wasn't expecting him. The surprise flickered in her eyes for only a moment before she masked it with composure. "Ryland," she said, her voice calm but firm. She didn't move toward him. She didn't step back. She stood her ground, as though she had already made peace with this moment. "I didn't expect to see you here," she continued, her tone neutral but with a touch of something Ryland couldn't quite place. Was it frustration? Resentment? Or was it just the realization that they no longer shared the same world? "I saw the proposal," he said, cutting through the silence. "I didn't know it was yours." She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible shift in her expression. "It's mine now." And just like that, the distance between them felt miles wide. This wasn't a confrontation. Not yet. But it was a reckoning. He had come here to negotiate, to persuade her. But now, standing in front of her, standing in the space she had created, he realized there was nothing to negotiate. She had already made her choice. She didn't need him. And that realization made the sting of his own mistakes sharper than anything else he had ever felt. Serafina stepped outside the warehouse with him, her footsteps steady, her posture unwavering. She didn't glance back at the others. They were her team now, her partners, and they knew better than to interfere. Once outside, the cool air of the evening wrapped around them. The sky was dimming, a thin line of pink tracing the horizon over the lake. The quiet of the town seemed to contrast with the quiet tension between them. Ryland looked at her, his words catching in his throat for a moment. He had prepared for this. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say. But now that he was here, it felt hollow. What could he say? What was there left to discuss? "I didn't know you were this far along," he began, his voice quieter than he intended. "I thought you were just building something small, not this." She met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "You thought wrong." He hesitated. "Why didn't you tell me?" She sighed, crossing her arms over her chest. "Why would I? You didn't leave room for me to be part of your world. You were too busy building your empire." Her words were blunt. They were not harsh. They were facts. "I'm not here for business," he said finally, trying to find his footing. "I'm here for you. I don't want a business alliance. I want my marriage back." The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment, there was silence. Ryland could feel the weight of it. He had said it, the thing he had avoided for so long. But even as he spoke it, he realized how much it was too late. Serafina's gaze softened, but it didn't waver. She wasn't moved by the words. She wasn't even angry. She was simply resolved. "I don't want a business alliance," Ryland repeated, his voice firm, though his chest tightened with uncertainty. "I want my marriage." Her eyes searched his face, not with contempt, but with a quiet understanding he hadn't expected. He had hoped that by saying it out loud, he could shift something in her, make her reconsider, make her see that he had changed. But Serafina wasn't looking for grand gestures. She wasn't interested in declarations that came too late. She shook her head slightly. "Ryland, it's not about business. It's about trust. It's about what I needed from you that I never got. And it's about what I'm choosing now for myself." Her words weren't cutting. They weren't cruel. But they were final. She stepped back slightly, giving them both space. "I don't need a marriage on my terms. I need respect, transparency, and consistency. Those are the conditions, Ryland." He stood there, processing her words. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for accountability, real, solid accountability, not in the form of promises, but in actions. She had drawn the line, not with anger, but with clarity. "I can give that," he said, his voice quieter now. But even as he said it, there was something uncertain in his tone. "I'll give you that." Serafina didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply turned her gaze back toward the lake, as if considering the gravity of what she was offering. When she spoke again, her voice was calm but filled with conviction. "Then start with respecting my space." He nodded slowly, the reality of it sinking in. "I understand." For the first time since arriving, Ryland felt the full weight of the shift between them. He had spent so long thinking that he could fix everything with grand gestures, with his usual precision. But Serafina wasn't asking for that. She was asking for him to change at a deeper level, on a fundamental daily basis. "Give me time," she said, finally turning back to him. "Trust is rebuilt, not given. We'll take things slowly. But that's the only way it will work. There's no shortcut this time." Her conditions were clear. No bargaining. No easy fixes. It would take time. And that was something Ryland hadn't been willing to give before. But now, for the first time, he was willing to try. Can someone truly change after betrayal, or is trust permanently altered? Let us know in the comments. Do you believe it's possible to rebuild trust after it's been broken? Or is trust something that, once lost, can never truly be regained? The first step toward rebuilding was not dramatic. It was methodical, structured. Serafina had set the terms. They would begin with weekly public meetings, neutral ground, where their interactions were clear and professional. There would be no emotional confrontations, no moments of uncontrolled vulnerability. Everything would be gradual, with clear boundaries. Ryland respected this. For the first time, he realized that respect wasn't just about giving her space physically. It was about respecting the emotional distance she needed. The weekly meetings started at a local cafe, where they would discuss the progress of the cooperative, local community outreach, and any logistical challenges. Serafina kept the tone straightforward. She didn't engage in casual small talk. She didn't make any effort to fill the silence with pleasantries. These meetings were about the work, and they would remain so until she saw it was possible to return to something more personal. Ryland, though accustomed to more personal settings, had no choice but to adapt. Each week he arrived at the cafe, prepared for the business at hand. He knew his words needed to be clear, concise, and professional. The meetings were not without tension, but it wasn't the kind of tension that came from anger. It was a tension born out of unmet expectations, born out of their shared history, and the understanding that they were both trying to find their way back to a connection that had been lost. For Ryland, the simplicity of the meetings was a relief. It gave him structure in a time when everything in his life felt chaotic. Yet, the emptiness of the space between them never fully went away. He was patient, but he wondered if patience would ever be enough. Therapy, too, had become a part of their structured rebuilding. It wasn't something Serafina had requested. It was Ryland's decision, his own choice to seek accountability and work through the emotional isolation that had driven him to take his wife for granted. In the therapy sessions, he spoke about everything: his childhood, the pressure he placed on himself, the weight of his career, and most importantly, his failures in his marriage. He began to unravel the carefully built facade of control and precision he had so expertly crafted. But each session was hard. It wasn't easy to admit his faults, to openly acknowledge how far he had pushed Serafina away. He had always been the strong one, the one who solved problems with logic, but now he was forced to face his own vulnerabilities. Every session made him uncomfortable. Every week, he walked out of the therapist's office feeling drained, exposed, unsure if he had made any progress at all. Yet, despite the discomfort, there was progress. With each session, he became more aware of the patterns in his behavior that had hurt Serafina. He learned about the importance of emotional presence, of listening without judgment. It wasn't just about giving apologies, it was about learning how to change his reactions, his responses, his ability to truly be there for her. Through therapy, Ryland began to realize that real healing wasn't about fixing problems. It was about understanding them, and understanding himself in the process. The therapy was never easy, but it was the first step toward genuine change. He began to see a different side of himself, one that wasn't defined by success or control, but by empathy and vulnerability. The discomfort didn't only exist in therapy. It was there in the moments between Ryland and Serafina as well, moments when they spoke to each other about their past, about their broken marriage, and about the painful changes they had both endured. Even in their weekly meetings, there was an undercurrent of unease that neither of them could escape. At first, Ryland wasn't sure how to navigate this discomfort. The distance between them was growing, but it wasn't just emotional. It was physical too. He could feel it in the way Serafina would hold herself back, in the way she would distance herself during their conversations. She wasn't cold, but she wasn't warm either. There was no softness in her gaze, no familiarity in the way she spoke. The emotional discomfort settled in the spaces between their words, between their movements. They weren't the same people who had shared quiet dinners or long walks. Their lives had changed, Serafina had changed, and so had he. For Ryland, this discomfort was his greatest challenge. He had never been good at sitting with discomfort. He was the kind of person who fixed things, made them better. But here, there was no quick fix. The change he wanted required patience, required him to sit with the unease, to let it exist without trying to erase it. He didn't know how long this discomfort would last, but one thing was clear: this wasn't something he could rush. And for the first time, he was willing to face it. The silence between them wasn't always filled with tension. There were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when something resembling normalcy returned. One evening, after a particularly challenging meeting about supply chain disruptions, Ryland made a joke. It wasn't witty, or even clever, but it broke the ice. For a moment, Serafina's face softened, her lips curving upward. She gave him a small, genuine smile. It was one of the first times in weeks that he felt like they were connected again, if only for a moment. She chuckled lightly, shaking her head as though she hadn't expected the humor from him. "You're terrible," she said, but her tone was light. It wasn't playful, but it wasn't dismissive either. Ryland realized that it wasn't the laughter itself that mattered. It was the shared moment. It was a break from the tension, a return to something comfortable. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that there was still something left between them. Later that evening, as they finished their meal in silence, Ryland couldn't help but smile to himself. It wasn't a grand breakthrough. It wasn't a declaration of love. But it was progress. They weren't quite back to where they had been, but for the first time in a while, it felt like they were moving in the right direction. And that small shared laughter was a sign that there was still hope. A week later, the weather took a turn for the worse. Ryland had driven Serafina home after another business meeting, the sky gray in threatening rain. When they stepped out of the car, the first drops began to fall, heavy and cold. They hurried toward the building's entrance, but before they could make it to the door, the downpour began. The storm wasn't a gentle shower. It was a full, sudden torrent of rain, the kind that soaked through clothes in seconds. They stood under the awning, the rain pouring down in front of them, but neither of them made a move to go inside. The space between them was still charged, but now, it was different. They were not trying to avoid each other's gaze. They were simply standing together, waiting for the storm to pass. Ryland looked at her, her wet hair clinging to her face, her expression unreadable. He stepped closer, instinctively, as if seeking shelter from the rain, but also seeking something else, some way to break through the wall that still stood between them. "I'm sorry," he said softly. his voice almost drowned out by the sound of the rain. "For everything." Serafina didn't respond right away. She stared ahead at the street, her eyes soft but distant. "It's going to take time," she said, her voice steady, but not without emotion. "But I'm willing to try." There was no grand gesture, no dramatic reconciliation, but there was something real in that moment, an understanding that the storm between them was not over, but it could be weathered, step by step. They didn't speak much more after that. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was shared understanding. And for the first time, Ryland felt like he was standing on solid ground again. As the rain slowed to a drizzle, Ryland reached for her hand. It wasn't rushed, nor was it bold. It was slow, almost tentative, as if testing the waters. He didn't expect her to respond, but when her fingers brushed against his, he felt the weight of the moment shift. Serafina didn't pull away. Her fingers lingered for a brief second before she gently squeezed his hand, a small, subtle sign of acknowledgement. It wasn't the grand gesture he had once imagined, a passionate kiss, a tearful reunion. But in that simple touch, something shifted. The connection was still fragile. It wasn't a declaration of love or an immediate forgiveness, but it was a start, the first small step toward rebuilding the intimacy that had been lost. It was real, quiet, unassuming. And for Ryland, it felt like the most honest form of intimacy they had shared in a long time. The touch of her hand didn't rush anything between them. It didn't demand immediate change. There was no sudden outpouring of affection. It was simple, restrained, and unhurried. Ryland understood now that the intimacy they needed wouldn't happen overnight. It wouldn't be forced. It had to rebuild naturally, one small step at a time. It was about showing up, not just in the big moments, but in the small, everyday acts that demonstrated care, patience, and respect. There were no more expectations, no pressure to move faster, to forgive more quickly. Everything would unfold at its own pace. There was no rush. For the first time in a long while, they stood in silence together, knowing that they didn't need to rush back to the way things were. The future was uncertain, but the foundation of their healing had begun, and that was enough for now. Can someone truly change after betrayal, or is trust permanently altered? Let us know in the comments below. Do you think trust can be rebuilt after it's broken, or is the damage irreversible? The first time the two entities met, it was not in the glossy confines of a high-rise conference room, nor in front of a packed auditorium. It was in the quiet back room of a small local cafe, where the lingering scent of freshly brewed coffee seemed to make the room feel less like business and more like a conversation. Ryland had come here not as the CEO of Cross Meridian, but as a man who was genuinely seeking something beyond a transaction, an opportunity to collaborate. Serafina had already established a reputation in the local business community. Her cooperative had gained traction among small businesses, and now Cross Meridian wanted to get involved. But the deal they were proposing wasn't about absorbing Serafina's operation into a corporate machine. It wasn't about assimilating her hard work into the behemoth Ryland had built. Instead, Ryland had pitched a partnership. Cross Meridian would provide resources, logistics, expertise, and funding, but Serafina's cooperative would remain independent. There would be no mergers, no buyouts, no takeover. They would work together, but on equal footing. No one would be swallowed up. Serafina, though initially cautious, had been intrigued by his offer. She had heard Ryland's words. She had watched his actions. This wasn't the same Ryland who had been driven by pride and unchecked ambition. This was someone who understood the value of community and saw the importance of keeping the integrity of small businesses intact. The proposal was formalized. There was no overzealous celebration, no grand announcement. It was simply an agreement between two entities that recognized the value of mutual respect. The contracts were signed, and the partnership was set in motion, with one clear rule: no one was absorbing anyone else. They would both grow, but on their own terms. The agreement was signed in the same cafe where the idea was first proposed, a quiet ceremony with no pomp, no flashing lights. The documents were simple, and their terms clear. For Ryland, this wasn't just about securing a new deal. It was a chance to do things differently. No longer would he be chasing after a goal without considering its human cost. He knew he couldn't afford to repeat the same mistakes. The terms of the agreement ensured that both Cross Meridian and the cooperative would be equally represented in any future projects. Cross Meridian would bring its infrastructure, its logistics, its massive reach. But Serafina's cooperative would retain its autonomy, its mission, and its core values. No one would impose their will on the other. The boardroom decisions would be shared. The risks would be shared. The benefits, too. It wasn't just about business anymore. This contract represented a fundamental shift in how Ryland saw the world. He realized that he could expand his business without compromising his own principles or those of the people he worked with. He no longer needed to dominate. He no longer needed to be the one in control. Serafina, too, could see the potential. For her, it wasn't about what Ryland was offering. It was about what he was willing to let go of. She had spent years fighting against corporate takeovers and the suffocating bureaucracy that came with them. This agreement felt different. For the first time in a long while, she felt that she wasn't being swallowed up by someone else's ambition. This partnership was one of mutual respect, not conquest. But not everyone was thrilled about this new direction. When Ryland presented the proposal to the board, the skepticism was immediate. Many of the board members were longtime investors in Cross Meridian, men and women who had seen Ryland's meteoric rise, who had shared in the glory of his aggressive expansion. They were used to dominating markets, not sharing space with smaller competitors. Why give up control? One board member asked. We've worked too hard to get where we are. Now we're just handing over resources to a small cooperative? Why not just acquire them outright? Ryland knew this would be a tough sell. He had spent years convincing these investors that growth meant conquering, not collaborating. But he also knew that the old way of doing things wasn't sustainable. Not anymore. We're not giving up control, Ryland explained, his tone calm but resolute. What we're doing is something bigger. We're changing the way we look at success. This is about building a future that doesn't rely on crushing smaller competitors. It's about strengthening our position by creating a sustainable, community-driven model. We're not just in this for profit. We're in this to build something that lasts. There was silence in the room. It wasn't the kind of silence Ryland was used to, the kind that signified agreement or applause. This was the silence of uncertainty. But Ryland stood firm. This was not a decision that could be undone, and he had already made up his mind. As the weeks passed, Ryland began aligning himself more publicly with Serafina's values. He joined her at community meetings, not as a businessman looking to negotiate, but as a partner, offering his expertise without expecting anything in return. He wasn't just looking at her as a business partner anymore. He was seeing her for who she truly was, someone whose mission and vision for community-driven change resonated with him more than he had initially realized. They attended local events together, speaking about the cooperative's success, sharing their belief that business could thrive while still prioritizing the people it served. Ryland spoke not only about Cross Meridian's role in the partnership, but about the larger shift in his thinking. He began to publicly acknowledge that the future of business wasn't about single-handed dominance. It was about collaboration, mutual respect, and collective growth. For Serafina, seeing Ryland change before her eyes was both encouraging and confusing. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this wasn't just a strategic move, that he wasn't simply trying to ease his way back into her life. But there was still a part of her that couldn't fully trust him, not yet. His actions, however, spoke louder than his words. With every public appearance they made together, with every event they hosted side by side, Ryland proved that he was not just making business decisions. He was making a personal commitment to change. For Serafina, the most striking thing about Ryland's transformation was not his grand gestures or his promises, it was the consistency. It wasn't something she had expected. She had seen Ryland make promises before, seen him vow to change, only to fall back into old habits. But this time was different. He wasn't just offering words. He was showing up, day after day, meeting her at the same time, following through on his commitments, and working side by side with her to build something meaningful. She began to notice small, everyday actions that made a big difference. He was there when he said he would be. He listened. He was no longer consumed by his own ambition. He began to take ownership of his mistakes without making excuses. It was this consistency that finally made Serafina see a glimmer of possibility. She had once feared that he would return to the man he had been, the man who put his career above everything else. But this new version of Ryland, this version who showed up, who listened, who was willing to learn, was someone she could respect. It wasn't enough yet for her to fully trust him, but it was a start. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Ryland and Serafina sat together at the same cafe where they had first discussed the proposal. The atmosphere was quiet, almost intimate, with the hum of conversation in the background and the soft clink of cups and plates. It felt like they had been here 1,000 times, yet this time, everything was different. They sat across from each other, the tension between them palpable. Not the kind of tension that was filled with anger or resentment, but a quieter, more complex form. They were no longer enemies. They were partners, still unsure, still testing the waters, but partners nonetheless. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, sipping their coffee, letting the silence stretch between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply a moment of reflection. Finally, Serafina broke the silence. "You've changed." Ryland looked at her, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm trying." She didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps hope, perhaps uncertainty. But there was something there, something that hadn't been there before. As the evening drew to a close, Serafina reached into her bag and pulled out the ring, the one Ryland had given her years ago. She had kept it all this time, not as a symbol of their past, but as a reminder of the standard she had set for herself. Without saying a word, she placed the ring on the table between them. The act was simple, but the message was clear. It wasn't about returning to the way things were. It wasn't about rushing back into a marriage. It was about moving forward, slowly, steadily, with no rush to reclaim what had been lost, but instead to rebuild it with a foundation of clarity and trust. Ryland's gaze lingered on the ring. There was no dramatic speech, no sudden confession of love. There was only the quiet understanding between them, the understanding that they were no longer moving toward each other with the same urgency they once had. They were moving forward, but in a new way. It wasn't about fighting for love. It was about fighting for trust. What do you think? Can someone truly change after betrayal, or is trust permanently altered? Let us know in the comments below. The decision to return to therapy wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. Ryland had suggested it first, weeks after the contract with Serafina's cooperative had been signed. But it was not a suggestion born out of guilt alone. It was born out of the realization that something deeper was at stake. He needed to understand what had gone wrong, not just in his marriage, but in the way he had approached relationships in general. Serafina had been hesitant at first. The memory of the betrayal was still fresh. Therapy wasn't just about talking things through. It was about opening up wounds that had not yet fully healed. But in the end, she agreed. Not because she thought it would fix everything, but because it was the only way forward. Their first session was quiet. The therapist, a woman who had worked with couples for years, was patient. She didn't push them to talk. She simply gave them the space to sit with each other and with their emotions. For the first time in a long time, Ryland felt uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being so exposed, so vulnerable. But it was necessary. Therapy wasn't just about talking. It was about listening to the other person's hurt, their disappointment, their need for change. Serafina spoke more than Ryland, which was a surprise. She had always been the one to give, to nurture, but here, in the safety of the therapist's office, she let herself speak her truth. She spoke about how she had felt invisible in their marriage, about how Ryland's emotional absence had made her question her own worth, and Ryland listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't make excuses. He just listened. For the first time in a long time, they were both hearing each other. The cracks in their marriage were not new. They had always been there, simmering beneath the surface, too subtle to notice until they were too deep to ignore. The emotional distance between them had started years before the betrayal, before Ryland had been consumed by his work, and before Serafina had withdrawn into herself to protect her heart. As they sat across from the therapist, the weight of these cracks was finally acknowledged. "I wasn't present," Ryland said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I was so focused on success, on building the business, that I forgot to show up in the ways that matter. I stopped being the man you married." Serafina's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "You were there physically, but emotionally you weren't. I didn't need your success. I needed you to be there for me. For us." The words hung in the air, heavy and true. It was an honest conversation, one that had been long overdue. There was no blame, no anger, just the raw truth of what had been missing between them. For the first time, Ryland could see the damage his emotional neglect had caused. He could see how Serafina had felt abandoned, not because of any major betrayal, but because he had allowed the distance to grow too wide between them. He had assumed that providing for her, that being successful, was enough. But he now understood that love required more than just the surface level. It required presence, attention, and consistency. The cracks, it seemed, had been there all along, but now they were finally being seen. And for the first time, they were willing to address them. Serafina had always been clear about what she needed in a relationship. She had always been the one to give, to support, to ensure that everything around her was in balance. But the betrayal had forced her to reevaluate what she was willing to accept and what she was no longer willing to tolerate. As the therapy sessions progressed, she began to articulate the boundaries she needed in their relationship. Boundaries that had been blurred or ignored in the past. She wasn't asking for grand gestures or extravagant promises. What she needed was simple respect, consistency, and emotional presence. "I can't go back to the way things were," Serafina said one afternoon, her voice calm but resolute. "I need to know that you can show up every day, that I'm not just someone you fit into your schedule when it's convenient. I need to feel like I matter, not just in the big moments, but in the small ones too." Ryland nodded, understanding that this wasn't an unreasonable request. He had taken her for granted for too long. He had assumed that love didn't need to be reinforced daily. But now, he saw that love required more than just consistency. It required an active effort, a willingness to check in, to be emotionally available. Serafina's boundary line was clear. It wasn't about controlling him or demanding perfection. It was about creating space for a healthier, more balanced connection. "I can do that," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'll show up. I won't take you for granted again." And for the first time, Serafina felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could work. The decision to put the ring back on her finger was not something that Serafina took lightly. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was a symbol, a quiet acknowledgement that she was willing to move forward, but only if Ryland was truly committed to making the necessary changes. After a few weeks of therapy and a steady flow of honest conversations, Serafina decided it was time to take a step. One evening, as they sat in the living room, she picked up the ring that had been left on the table during their previous conversation. The weight of it felt different now. It wasn't a symbol of loss, but of possibility. Without saying a word, she slipped the ring back onto her finger. Ryland watched her, his heart heavy with gratitude and emotion. He didn't ask her why. He didn't demand an explanation. He simply understood that this was a choice that would require him to earn her trust again, one small step at a time. The ring, once a symbol of a marriage that had been broken, now felt like the first sign of hope. They were not rushing back into the old dynamics, but they were willing to build something new, something stronger. Ryland's heart swelled with an emotion he hadn't fully understood until now. He wasn't just trying to win her back. He was trying to prove to her that he could be the man she deserved. The kiss was not forced, nor was it rushed. It came after a long night of quiet conversation, after hours of sitting side by side, talking about the future. It was gentle, soft, and slow. A simple touch that held the weight of everything they had been through and everything they hoped to build. Serafina turned toward him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She didn't need words in this moment. She didn't need declarations. She just needed to feel that the space between them could be closed, that they could still find their way back to each other. Ryland leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. The kiss was brief, but it was enough. There was no urgency, no wild passion, just the quiet understanding that they were starting over, not in the same way, but in a way that felt right. They weren't trying to fix what was broken. They were learning how to love each other again, slowly, carefully, and without expectation. The kiss didn't promise a perfect future. It didn't erase the past, but it was a step forward. A small but significant sign that they were willing to try. Later that night, after the kiss, they moved to the bedroom, but it wasn't a scene of passionate reconciliation. It was quiet, simple, almost peaceful. They lay side by side, their bodies not touching, but their presence filling the space between them. It wasn't the comfort of old habits. It wasn't the easy intimacy they had once shared. But there was something new in the air, a kind of peace, a kind of understanding that neither of them had felt in a long time. Ryland's hand reached out to gently brush against hers. Serafina didn't pull away. She let her fingers slide into his, the simple gesture speaking volumes. This wasn't about rushing to fix everything. It was about taking the time to rebuild. And for the first time in months, they fell asleep in the same bed, not as husband and wife who had failed, but as two people who were choosing each other again, in the quietest, most deliberate way. In the months that followed, the cooperative continued to grow. It wasn't just Serafina's work anymore. It had become something larger, something that belonged to a community. She wasn't just working with small business owners. She was working alongside them, building something that supported their collective success. Ryland played his part too. He didn't take over the cooperative. He didn't try to absorb it into Cross Meridian. Instead, he offered his logistical expertise, helping to streamline processes, cutting down on costs, and improving the supply chain. He wasn't in the forefront. He wasn't looking for recognition. He was simply there, supporting her, supporting the community. The partnership between Cross Meridian and Serafina's cooperative wasn't just about business. It was about shared values, shared responsibility. They had built something together that was bigger than any single deal or contract. They had built a sustainable, community-driven model for success. Their marriage, too, began to rebuild. Slowly, steadily. They had learned that love was not a transaction, not something to be won or lost. It was a choice that required consistent effort, open communication, and, most importantly, clarity. Ryland didn't expect everything to be perfect. He knew there would be challenges. There would be moments when they would both falter. But what they had built, slowly and steadily, was a relationship founded on mutual respect and clear understanding. They weren't just trying to survive anymore. They were learning how to thrive together. As they stood together, hand in hand, watching the cooperative flourish, they knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But it would be theirs, and they would face it together. If you were Serafina, would you have returned? Could you have found it within yourself to trust again after everything that happened? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Love Tales with Mr. Easton. Like and share this video. Your thoughts mean the world to us.